Now it gets even worse because it turns out they themselves, the people who were doing these digital forensics, were the ones creating Russian bot farms. Her firm literally created a fake Russian bot farm. This is the person deciding what is and is not Russian bots. Then they mass subscribed them to their political opponents and then told the mainstream media that those Republicans were being backed by Russian bots that they themselves created. And what's worse is that they pivoted from that false fake predicate of Russian disinformation to straight up domestic misinformation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, a platform dedicated to exploring the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. Today, I am joined by Mike Benz. Mike Benz is the executive director of the Foundation for Freedom of Line and former State Department diplomat. So, Mike, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
So, I was mind blown by your insight into what happened with the rate limits, with Elon Musk's decision to decrease the rate limits on Twitter. And for me personally, since I wasn't really, familiar with the topic in itself, it just sounded like another Musk move, right? It was just another thing he would do. Typical Musk meme move. And then you published a really interesting video explaining how this turns into a power play or a chessboard between AI censorship, a new concept in my mind, because I've been concerned with AI and deepfakes. I've been concerned with AI and misinformation, but I've never really connected the dots with censorship. So when I heard, I was lucky to find you online, and then I was really interested in getting to know you, your trajectory, and your whole vision in this. So first of all, Mike, I would love for our listeners to hear your trajectory. How has it been unfolding up until today?
Sure. Well, my personal trajectory, I was a tech lawyer representing tech firms, media firms, and financial institutions. And I sort of got into the tech space at the sort of practitioner level of the State Department, where I ran the cyber portfolio for essentially the U.S. foreign policy establishment. I came into that through tracking the AI censorship story. See, I was a sort of competitive chess player as a kid, and I sort of came of age during that period when Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue. And at the time, all the old heads who had been sort of talking about, oh yeah, chess computers, they'll beat club players, but they'll never beat masters. Oh, they're beating masters, they'll never beat grandmasters. They're beating grandmasters, they'll never beat Garry Kasparov. And then Deep Blue beats Garry Kasparov, and for the rest of time, it's like the soul got sucked out of chess. It ended the romantic period. Mm-hmm. It was something that was very traumatic for a lot of the older generation of people. But as a kid, I was already using, as it was all the other kids around me, that we were all using chess engines to analyze our games, and it seemed completely inevitable that these were going to be the way forward. And when I came across in August 2016 a series of white papers and some public source information online around the use of AI for censorship, I started dabbling with them, and I saw that they work very similar to the way chess engines do, where it spits out like a position, and you could do the same thing about a political narrative. And the implication for that power to do to speech on the internet what Deep Blue did to the chess world seemed completely self-evident to me. I tried to tell everybody in my network, everybody in the sort of tech community I was a part of. Nobody believed me at the time. And so I sort of set about on this mission to try to prove my case. And that took me on this kind of, rollicking journey through the U.S. government. I worked for the Trump administration as a speechwriter and as a tech policy advisor, then at the State Department, and now in my job at FFO. But it's here. Just to sort of close the point on this, the internet is censored by AI. 99% of all takedowns on YouTube, Google, TikTok, Reddit, they're all pre-flagged by AI. This is not some future threat. When I first started studying it, it was in its infancy. It's not quite its maturity, but we are very much in the adolescence era of the AI censorship superweapons. That's how the entirety of the COVID pandemic was censored. And now as I see it, I'm on a mission to try to halt its development into its final form.
Wow. It's, that huge statement you just said that AI is here, this technology is here, is really remarkable. I would like to get on that deeper into the conversation. But you mentioned right now something really interesting, that you worked within big tech before working in the government, in State Department, and you received pushback, you received skepticism into mentioning, to your circle, to your network, that, hey, these technologies, AI censorship, are beginning to really come and make a play into, literally, on a very literal sense, not a metaphorical sense, the internet. One of the statements you've done in previous interviews is that the internet is not a lemonade stand. It's literally the hearts and minds of people. That really struck me. That was really profound. And so, first of all, why the pushback? Why the pushback from these big tech companies saying, this is far-fetched, or, this is just not here yet? And then I would like you to define for our listeners, and for me personally, what do you think, or what truly is the definition of misinformation, what misinformation truly is, and how does that play into the role of censoring with AI?
Sure. So, when I was a lawyer, a lot of this back in 2016, 2017, a lot of this seemed very fanciful and far off at the time. And it was something that, it wasn't even really until the last 12 to 18 months that there was a universal acceptance around the existence of a censorship industry that combines the government, the private sector, civil society, and the news media and fact-checking orgs. At the time, it was something that you really had to sort of be online to witness. And then the idea that the U.S. government was funding it, you could show people receipts. You could show that there were these DARPA grants for all these natural language processing, machine learning, AI, sort of semantic analysis, sentiment analysis type things. But people couldn't really at the time glimpse into a future that seemed so dystopian and Orwellian. I think there was a kind of cocoon that people built around their minds that the internet was always going to be free, because internet freedom was something that came from the U.S. national security state. It was our State Department, our Pentagon, our CIA and NSA that actually projected the internet out into the world from 1991 until 2016 as a means of soft power influence, so that we could detect political birds of a feather overseas. We could have a political radar system to be able to detect the evolution of political movements and insurgency movements abroad. It wasn't until that started resulting in electoral outcomes or social pushback domestically that we entered this censorship era. And then just on the misinformation front, I can tell you how censorship insiders define misinformation versus disinformation and malinformation. They will tell you misinformation is when someone is wrong, but with a benign purpose. They really believe it. Disinformation, they will say, is it's wrong and they know it in advance, so they're sort of lying and committing fraud. And malinformation is when it's true information, or at least information that is not falsifiable by fact checkers, but nevertheless creates something misleading in its totality, and that undermines public faith or confidence in democratic institutions. That's what they'll tell you. But that's all gobbledygook and noise. They themselves will. I just posted this yesterday on my social media feed at Mike Ben Cyber that Rene DiResta, who's one of the lieutenants in this space, openly says that we should disregard the distinction between misinformation and disinformation and just stick to rumors. We just have the national security state censor rumors because it's too hard to disentangle intent, and people who spread misinformation really shouldn't be in a protected class above disinformation. And the U.S. Department of Homeland Security took the same position. I posted clips from DHS censorship training sessions where they instructed people in state secretaries of state's offices, basically U.S. state-level censorship cells around elections, to disregard the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Because if censors have to do an intent analysis about whether people are wrong on purpose or wrong by accident, then their misinformation will already spread. And their goal is to stop your speech before it ever makes impact. So they need to censor it quickly. So they want to abandon that distinction altogether. So I don't respect that distinction. I don't think they do either.
Wow. And right now you mentioned, literally, you said wrong on purpose or wrong by accident. We can really discern the distinction between those. And it made me think on, I've been reflecting on how the algorithms, and now we'll get into AI, have really transformed the way a human life unfolds. Pretty much our whole lives are driven by the internet and what we see on the internet. And you've been mentioning a couple of times now the 2016 year, the year of 2016. And as we know, the 2016 elections were one of the most pivotal moments in terms of, election misinformation, disinformation. All these themes started to go around the internet and around our minds. And so it got me thinking right now, that listening to you, Mike, that for me personally, I don't know if I'm being wrong on purpose or wrong by accident, since I'm just scrolling on the internet and reading what from quote unquote very legitimate sources or not, or people who are experts or not, are saying. And so I adopt these ideas. And so how was that? You've had an outstanding trajectory and a pivotal moment on that trajectory, 2016. What changed then? What changed in 2016 in terms of all of this conversation on being wrong on purpose and being wrong on accident?
Well, what changed were two seismic events that were like a bolt out of nowhere that the national security state, on both sides of the Atlantic, both in the U.S. and Europe, were not expecting. And the first was the Brexit vote in June 2016, and then the second was the election of Donald Trump here in the U.S. And even in advance of that, the censorship industry really started in 2014, as I see it. That was when NATO, the Western Military Alliance, U.S., U.K., Brussels, and all the NATO states got together and declared something called the hybrid warfare doctrine. This is in response to the Crimea referendum in Ukraine. There was a revolution in Ukraine, let's just say, in 2014 that had, I'll just say, some involvement with the U.S. embassy there and with U.S. and U.K. stakeholders. There was a sort of counter coup in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, and it led to these breakaway regions, and it was proving very difficult for NATO stakeholders to be able to win the hearts and minds of people in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So they declared this doctrine called the hybrid warfare doctrine, which was the idea that, in the words of NATO, and they created a formal predicate for this, they said warfare has gone from tanks to tweets. That is that, it's gone from being a kinetic thing to being a psychological and kinetic thing. And there was all of this infrastructure set up in Central and Eastern Europe, everywhere from Ukraine to Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of these Department of War, Department of State, CIA, NSA capacities built around psychological resilience in those Eastern European buffer states from 2014 to 2016. In 2016, when the Brexit vote happened, that initial censorship architecture set up by these transatlantic governments came into the Western world. That is, the very month after the June 2016 Brexit vote, at the Warsaw Conference in July 2016, NATO updated its charter to allow hybrid warfare, to do this civil society capacity building, to pump money into universities, to pump money into NGOs, to pump money into all of these intelligence cutouts for the purposes of censoring the internet. And at the time, in June 2016, they were extremely concerned that NATO itself would come undone because Marine Le Pen was surging in the polls in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy. You were going to have Grexit, Spexit, Italexit, Grexit, Brexit. The entire EU would come undone. NATO would come undone. There'd be no enforcement arm for the World Bank or the IMF. The rules-based international order would collapse and the world would end. This is the way the national security state saw the world in 2016 coming apart, and they blamed the free and open internet for it. They said this is all happening because populist groups in Europe and in the US are using social media to circumvent the traditional media gatekeepers who used to keep these kinds of foreign policy ideas in check. We had a very controlled mainstream media ecosystem from the 1940s up until really the mid-aughts. It wasn't until social media and uncensored social media allowed accounts to accumulate subscriberships on par with major mainstream newspapers that you even had an alternative to Pentagon, State Department, press release media. And when those started resulting in electoral outcomes that challenged that sort of uniparty foreign policy consensus, from 2016 was really that era of the revenge of the gatekeepers, the empire striking back in that way. And we're only now really putting together some sort of pushback against that.
And right now you mentioned the notion that, the traditional gatekeepers were starting to sense the table was beginning to turn into decentralized information, or, for example, channels like mine, or, smaller channels being closer to the truth, being closer to the source, and being able to just publish what they have to say and going viral, or, having a platform of one Twitter account having 6 million followers and just moving the needle more than they could ever. And I remember that in 2016, the idea, this is like, just to put the context of what I'm saying, it's like the good side, right? I don't have this intention of I'm not a troll farm and I'm not trying to create misinformation. But on the other hand, it did exist, right? That in 2016 specifically, and with regard to the election, we began to see these troll farms, this darker side of bots mentioning stuff that was misinformation. So because I say this, because they were reports that were Russian troll farms saying, this campaign, am I wrong at all? Because I see your reaction.
Well, sorry, I wear my heart on my sleeve. You're not wrong that there were those reports, but all of them turned out to be completely compromised and discredited. I mean, I'll walk through it.
Yes. So
the institutions that made those forensic, they call them digital forensic investigations. The idea of forensics as a crime scene investigation, and digital forensics firms are the firms that go in and they sort of deduce how a narrative started and who were the accounts and actors and the network connections and what happens when you trace their IP addresses. Every single aspect of the Russian troll farm narrative was completely worthless from top to bottom. We'll just go through like the list. So first of all, there were these Justice Department indictments of the Internet Research Agency. This Prigozhin source, internet troll farm is what we were told it was. They indicted 13 individuals. The Justice Department actually dropped those cases 2 years after they filed them, when the defendants, who didn't even need to defend themselves because they were Russian, they didn't need to appear in U.S. court or file a defense motion. When two of the defendants actually responded to the indictment and were on the cusp of winning discovery motions for how it is that the U.S. government decided they were troll farms, the Justice Department immediately dropped the case, saying if they had to disclose how they knew they were Russians, then it would undermine U.S. national security, and so it's not even worth trying to prosecute the case. Then you've got the actual forensic identification themselves. They were done by firms like Graphica, by firms like New Knowledge, and by firms like the Atlantic Council Digital Forensics Research Lab, and others who have all been busted identifying humans as bots. There was a guy named Ben Nimmo who worked for both Graphica and the Atlantic Council DFR Lab, who made a big deal about these accounts being Russian bots, and then they all started going on TV and saying, actually, hey, my name is Ian. I'm a real person. I don't know why this U.S. government-funded, Pentagon-funded, digital forensic shop identified me as a human. They were using totally rigged methodology. They were saying if someone was spewing anti-NATO talking points or pro-Corbynite in the UK or pro-Trump in the US, and they tweeted with a frequency of 50 or more times a day, then they were a presumptive bot. Now, it gets even worse because it turns out they themselves, the people who were doing these digital forensics, were the ones creating Russian bot farms. I'll give you an example. I talked earlier about an individual named Renee DiResta who recently called to abandon the distinction between mis and disinformation. Now, she's a former Central Intelligence Agency veteran. She worked for the CIA. She's currently at the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is essentially a government cutout university center. She previously wrote the report on Russian disinformation. Her firm, New Knowledge, wrote portions of that Senate intelligence report, which is the official, proof, it said, of Russian interference in the 2016 election. 2 years later, after she wrote that report, it came out that her own firm, New Knowledge, of which she was the technical director, was busted buying Russian bots. Okay, you can look this up. The New York Times, the Washington Post all report on this. They bought a bot farm with 23,000 fake accounts so that it would look like it was coming from Russia. They used VPNs to simulate Russian server access. They mass subscribed them to a Republican U.S. Senator named Roy Moore in the special election in November 2017. While she was being funded by Democrat operatives, her firm literally created a fake Russian bot farm. This is the person deciding what is and is not Russian bots. Then they mass subscribed them to their political opponents and then told the mainstream media that those Republicans were being backed by Russian bots that they themselves were created, and they got busted doing it. And then she went on to be, this figure partnered with the Department of Homeland Security to censor the 2020 election and to censor COVID-19. So every single one of the data points that we have heard about Russian disinformation have been discredited, both at the forensic level and at the actual messenger level of who's the one making these determinations. And what's worse is that they pivoted from that false fake predicate of Russian disinformation to straight up domestic misinformation with, you don't even need a Russian predicate now, right? I mean, all that censorship started with this idea of a national security threat from Russian trolls and bot farms when they couldn't find anybody. When the U.S. government was leaning on the Twitter trust and safety teams and YouTube and Facebook to find these Russians that they couldn't find, half of whom were supporting Black Lives Matter, by the way, and were supporting leftist groups. And they had to, and I'm not making this partisan, but they had to come up with this idea. Well, if they're supporting both the right and the left, then they must be just trying to divide people. So they're coming up with this scheme that even if they support Hillary Clinton, even if they support both sides, then that's somehow supporting Trump, even if they support the opposition to Trump. So the whole thing to me is fake and discredited, and I don't assign any legitimacy to it whatsoever.
Wow, that's really, really insightful, and honestly, it's one of the first moments ever since I adopted this idea that there were Russian troll farms in 2016 that I hear these factual counter ideas, and it's not out there. It really.
And they knew it. I'm sorry to interrupt, but they knew this at the time. I was watching these State Department officials travel across the Atlantic and say, we need a predicate, okay? Yes, I know it's not Russians who are supporting the Five-Star Movement in Italy. It's not the Russians who are primarily backing Brexit or Marine Le Pen in France. But we need some intervening step because we've got 2.5 centuries of free speech, diplomacy, and doctrines in the West. People are not going to accept censorship on its face. We need some sort of measure that we can loop in, that we can create you can use a counterintelligence predicate for all this. They were talking about that in their own conferences in 2017. And then even at the scale, I just have to say one more data point. There was only about $100,000 in Facebook ads that were ever identified coming from Russians, is what it was said. $100,000. That's one single middle-class salary in the U.S. Hillary Clinton spent $1.3 billion on the U.S. election. If $100,000, one person's salary is enough to shift an entire election, then we've got problems far beyond. I mean, even if you accept at face value, what I've already said is should not be accepted. This is something that a court would say you would dismiss on summary judgment, because even if you accept their facts, it still would not rise to the level of any sort of material interference. So I'm sorry, back to you, Al.
No, that's okay. And so the first, bounce question is, there are bots on the internet, no? There are bots that are tweeting or saying ideas. That's true.
Yes. Totally.
Okay, so that's also good to know because, the whole Twitter buying bonanza with Elon Musk saying that there are a lot of bots or no, it's just good to know also. How do you, Mike, identify those accounts? How do you keep an alert eye just so I also, and our listeners too, can appreciate a distinction between a bot and a real person?
Yeah, the way that it's usually done is by looking at coordinated activity. Once digital forensics investigators are able to identify, say, common language, because oftentimes what you'll have several thousand accounts all tweeting the same thing within a very short space of time. These things are very crude. No one's fooled by these. They all have, eggs. If you use Twitter, for example, because that's the easiest platform to do this on because it's all open. It's not a walled garden like Facebook or YouTube. And so, these will be egg accounts that'll say reg 047999213, and it'll be tweeting something similar or identical to Gen 974423, all created in a very similar space of time. There has never been a sort of sophisticated, influential election dispositive version of that. These things are very crude. They're very easy to catch. But when you make when you put the determinations in the hands of political operatives who are tied to the national security state and who are trying to essentially put their thumb on the press of elections, they can fudge those determinations and say that real people who they want to get rid of are a part of that campaign. And that's another sort of word that they use in censor speak. They try to say everything is a campaign. If you think that masks were not effective at containing COVID-19, then you tweeted about that, you are now participating in a disinformation campaign to discredit. It's like saying, my 95-year-old grandmother who lives in Boca who's always voted for Democrats her whole life is on the Joe Biden campaign, because she tells her bridge partners that, she doesn't like Trump. I mean, they rig the language to create censorship predicates.
Wow. And that's absolutely a perfect segue into, getting deeper into AI and deeper into the ideas that happened in the previous month, this month with Elon Musk's rating decrease limit. But just to give an emphasis on this, I'm really, really shocked with what you just mentioned on the idea of the troll farms, because really, I know you worked within that world, with that universe, and with President Trump, and so just me mentioning it's not to imply that it was saying that Trump election was a bad one, or just it was because other people wanted him. So I wanted to just mention that, and I know. Go ahead.
Oh no, it's just that this isn't even me saying it. All of the major players in the censorship industry have abandoned the idea of trolls and bot farms as being influential. Mike, I mean, I put up a compilation just on my Twitter account 2 days ago of Michael Chertoff, Renee DiResta, Alex Stamos, all of these major figures in 2016 talking about Russian trolls and bot farms. And then in 2019, as soon as the Mueller investigation ended, saying, you know what, actually, there really were no important Russian bots and trolls. They really didn't have any influence. It really wasn't very sophisticated. Really, the problem is domestic politicians who are using their platforms to spread misinformation here. So they've all jumped off of this. Nobody accepts it anymore. And because if they had to be relegated to that, they wouldn't be able to censor the internet.
Yeah, and this can be a whole conversation in and of itself. So hopefully in the future we get to discuss that in depth. I want to get into the AI ideas on what you mentioned, which is the threat is here. And this really connects into what you were saying, that these domestic politicians, let's just put that example on, are using or misconstructing the definitions of misinformation, or just everything has become really muddy. The water is really muddy. So for me personally, it's just really hard to distinguish when a politician is saying, this is complete misinformation, or this is because X company or X newsletter or X whoever is just stating something against my ideas, and then an actual, it's just facts are really hard to distinguish from truth and from fiction, and it's just really hard. And why I wanted to mention the 2016 date is because it seemed that from there, this whole Pandora box of just muddying the water was unleashed, at least from my perspective. At least that's how I sensed it. And so, Mike, now that we're approaching another presidential election, we're being bombarded with this whole concept, which, I would love you to really expand on, the true definitions of them, or, AI scraping, data scraping, censorship, and all of these themes that when I'm listening to you, I sometimes forget about them. So I just put it out there because I'm really engaged in what you're saying. But now it seems that the Pandora box is not 2x unleashed. It's not 5x. It's 1,000x. It seems like the exponential curve of the things that we're going to see, not only in terms of deep fakes, like I mentioned previously, but in terms of, I don't really even know what's going to happen. It's hard it's difficult to imagine. So, Mike, please just walk me through how you started the conversation with the AI threat of censorship is here, and how will that play out really in the really short-term presidential election cycle. Now that we mentioned the 2016, and let's then get into the future of the internet and freedom and censorship.
Yeah, so the AI censorship era is here. It has been here since late 2017, and the AI censorship Death Star weapon that I talk about, just to flesh that out. So yeah. In Star Wars, there was this Death Star that Darth Vader is on, and the idea is it's got this giant ray gun that can just blow up entire planets. And so they don't even need to go down with an army of 100,000 or 1 million people and invade the planet, militarily occupy it, and suppress insurgency groups. They can just fire one gun and blow up the entire planet, and it's over. Mm-hmm. This is sort of similar to how nuclear weapons had changed the military terms of engagement after World War II. What AI censorship enables is, rather than having hundreds of thousands of sensors to contain, and it really is at that level. There's well over 200,000 people who work in the content moderation industry. When you add up the 60 plus universities, the 100 plus NGOs, the dozens of government departments and agencies, the transatlantic side of that, both in the U.S. and then in every NATO country. And then at the mechanical Turk level of actually, clicking the buttons in the dashboards to take information down. But you don't need hundreds of thousands of people to contain a narrative if you can simply use a few lines of code to blow up an entire narrative all at once. This is what was done. No, I was a political appointee in the Trump administration. That's on my resume. I don't consider myself to be a politically partisan person, but I try not to get into the substance of particular things like mail-in ballots and are they safe or not. I try to stay at the censorship layer. But the fact is we, in the 2020 election, we had a really extraordinary thing where it was the first time universal mass mail-in ballots were ever used in this country. They have had a very dicey reputation ever since the election of 1864 with Abraham Lincoln. There were controversies around fraud with mail-in ballots. The fact is that the election did play out with 7 states all flipping. The election result actually flipping as the result of mail-in ballots the day after the election. And every state adopted these mass mail-in ballot rules, but they did so in an environment where the information ecosystem was rigged, because AI censorship tools were used to blow up the planet of talking about mail-in ballots. The Department of Homeland Security partnered with this pressure group called EIP, without getting into too much detail, to create a speech ban on anyone who is said to discredit the perceived legitimacy of mail-in ballots. And they programmed this in at the AI layer. So anyone who talked about fraud, anyone who talked about safety and security issues with these, would all lose their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, their Google accounts if they talked about it. It had a massive chilling effect. And look, if you don't have a Google account or a Facebook account, you can't have a sales and marketing job in this country. I mean, there are millions of people who have flower shops, and who felt chilled that if they said, "Hey, I'm not actually sure I want my local representative to support this mail-in ballot measure, you can't even advertise on, next door. You can't even, advertise your donut shop unless you've got access to these platforms. So people keep their mouths shut. They self-censor. And then this creates a political inertia so that you can't even change the policy because you can't create the pressure for it online to do it. The same thing was rolled out for COVID-19. This group, the Virality Project, detailed 66 different narratives that they help the social media companies mass ban at the narrative level using AI. So that is anyone who talked about COVID origins, anyone who talked about negative efficacy on vaccines, anyone who talked about, about mandates and lockdowns. They had 66 different narratives, which are all programmed into the AI layer. So you can just imagine this censorship Death Star every time a million people get together and say, you know what, I'm not a big fan of lockdowns and my business being shuttered. This Death Star just goes around and says, okay, everyone in this community, we're now evaluating you as a political birds of a feather for being vaccine hesitant or for being, mandate skeptical. We are now going to blow up this entire planet online. That is, they all get algorithmically throttled. They all get throttled at the same trust and safety layer. And it just takes them all out at once. It's like if after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. had just gone around and used nukes in the Korean War, and then used nukes in skirmishes in Latin America. We are at this point now where these censorship super weapons, there's no terms of engagement on how to restrain them. There's no non-proliferation, and they're being used to control political outcomes in every major election in the world now, including through our CIA, which is now working in 85 different countries, rolling out this AI censorship infrastructure to rig elections in Ghana, Tanzania, Latin America. I mean, they think this is the key to political control.
Wow, that's brilliantly put. That, I've been also thinking about that idea that we are really playing with AI and there's no regulation, there is no framework to play with it. It's just, let's just go with it as it goes. And like you say, it has real life consequences, not only in elections, which elections are really, that in of itself, that's just huge, but personal decisions of, where to live, who to speak with, who to engage with, who to, all of these ideas of civil discourse, the fabrics of society. How do I engage with people, in the grocery store? Maybe they're other political parties, so I'm skeptical about them. Even the fabric of the American society in itself has come into real impact with AI. And so it's really interesting. This Death Star, Mike, that you touch on, I'd like to get on, how is it being fed? Because what information are they using? I personally believe that, I've had different conversations in the podcast in terms of AI, but I also feel that they're not getting the whole sense of who Alex is or who Mike is. They're just getting the internet, and they're getting my TikTok dances. They're taking my jokes, all of that. So how accurate is the Death Star? Well, that's a stupid question since it's moving elections in and of itself. But really, you know what I'm saying, that, how is it getting fed, this?
Yes. So it's getting fed, like you said, by your TikTok dances and by, everybody has a digital identity, a cross-platform digital identity in the aggregate, your presence on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, on TikTok, on Reddit. And just as a digital identity exists for individuals, it also exists for political movements, for social movements, for political parties. There is a digital fingerprinting process that AI models ingest. So the first thing they do is they collect huge amounts of data. So, for example, I mentioned the example of mail-in ballots in elections. Now, this group EIP, which is the Department of Homeland Security's censorship lapdog, essentially, they had 22 million tweets identified by AI as misinformation because they undermined faith and confidence in mail-in ballots. That is, they delegitimized them in the public eyes, and so they were prima facie, de facto misinformation. That was identified using AI. But in order to get 22 million tweets identified by AI that way, they had to ingest 859 million tweets. 859 million. So that's basically a billion tweets for the entirety of the election cycle, for the 5-month period of the run-up. Basically every tweet on Twitter, I mean, not quite, but essentially a huge proportion of every tweet, for a 5-month span, in the U.S. and in certain jurisdictions in the run-up to an election, and then to chunk from there what people are saying about a particular narrative they want censored, to build these models in order to fine-tune the accuracy. And what you were just saying about the accuracy of the models is very interesting, because these started off as very rudimentary. This whole technique of political radar systems built out of ingesting social media data was really fine-tuned during the ISIS era, when DARPA and the Defense Department and the State Department and the CIA and the NSA there was this interagency consensus that we needed to track how terrorists talk online. ISIS was said to be a homegrown threat, is recruiting impressionable young Americans on Facebook and Twitter. So we need to come up with this AI technique to automatically survey prospective or current members of ISIS, what kind of language do they use, what words, what prefixes and suffixes are unique to their lingo, and then to be able to capture them all in a network graph, and then to mass throttle them and only them so that they would be censored, but it wouldn't infringe on, bona fide political debates in the U.S. They refined this AI censorship technique from 2014 to 2016. And then it went on steroids after the 2016 election, when all the money moved into this as a political weapon. It went from being counterterrorism to being a political control mechanism. But the fact is, look, it took chess computers 40 years to get to the point where they could there were chess computers in the 1970s that were underdeveloped. They were terrible in the beginning. They were a joke. They would make moves that were worse than, children. And so it went from being a laughing, it's like that Gandhi quote, right? First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Yeah. Well, if you can imagine the evil dystopian version of that, it's like people laughed at AI censorship because it was so crude, and, there would be a word that they would want to ban, and you would just change the spelling of the word. You'd use an @ symbol instead of an A, or, you'd put 2 L's instead of 1 L. And it was like a cute way to work around AI censorship, just detecting rudimentary, crude keywords. But it is so much more sophisticated than that now, because there's thousands of people who are working on this new Manhattan project to constantly refine it. They're getting huge amounts of government money to do it. My foundation, FFO, has documented over $100 million that have gone from the federal government just for AI censorship. $40 million from the National Science Foundation, $25 million from DARPA and DOD, $20 million from the State Department, a couple million from the NIH and HHS. And it's all to create AI as a fast, precise, and comprehensive way of doing it, which first requires ingesting all of the data on the internet and then creating these maps of meaning out of them in order to micro-target, to turn down the wrong thinkers and turn up the authoritative sources, the vetted journalists and researchers who are now sort of a privileged class in the search results.
Wow. And personally, if I were to have that power of, unleashing AI and giving AI the power to say this is true, this is false, when you listen it from a person, you are a bit skeptical, okay, so what is their intention, But when it's AI, it's just like, it's a chess move. You just hear it as at face value, because it's just, we don't even know how it works, It's just really legit. So if AI says this is true and this is false, people will begin to just adopt it at face value. Am I making sense?
No, you are. But there's a funny thing that's happening right now. There was a period before some of the really, really dominant chess engines took over. There was a period after the Deep Blue match with Garry Kasparov until just a couple of years ago, where there was something called chess DJing, which was this idea that, which is that yes, no human can take on any individual chess computer, but grandmasters who could DJ different sets of chess engines could actually defeat a chess engine. That is, if you could have in front of you 7 or 8 different chess engines, all spinning out what they think is the preferred sort of, candidate move, then you could actually be better than any individual chess computer. And so there was this sort of DJing of working with all these different chess engines to find the optimal way to play chess. And right now we're sort of in the chess DJing era of AI censorship. That is, we are not yet at the point where, you've got like this Google open mind thing that defeats even the chess DJ people. It is not yet in its final form. AI still has trouble with satire. It still has trouble with deadpan. It still has trouble with certain forms of humor and with certain forms of semantically difficult to disentangle. It's very good at network level analysis. Sentiment analysis is still lagging. It's improving every year. But right now we're at a point where you can aggregate all these different models to really fine tune everything. And it still requires these creations of huge code books of political movements, to do. So I guess just, back to your point about accuracy and precision, as I see it, the day will come where this is completely inescapable and there's nothing, you've got no hope. Unless we have a sort of nuclear non-proliferation, sort of setup, where, look, if you think about nuclear weapons, there was a period where, the atom bombs that were dropped in World War II pale in comparison to the neutron bomb, the hydrogen bombs and these incredible, Tsar bombas that were all developed in the Bikini Islands and in Russia. They got to be thousands of times more powerful than what was actually used as a weapon of war. But they were sort of, there were treaties that were put in place to stop the testing, to stop them. There's not the same level of money going into it now. There's not the same level of testing. They're still on the map. We may end up in nuclear war with what's happening right now with the current conflict in Russia, Ukraine. But the fact is we've had 70 years of saying, actually, it was kind of messed up what happened at the end of World War II. Maybe it was the right thing, maybe it wasn't, but we need to come to an agreement as mankind that these weapons should not be used as the daily, as a first line of defense. We have not yet had that conversation with AI censorship, but it needs to happen, because if this becomes the norm, like what happened in 2020, then you're never going to have another, genuine election in any democracy ever again. You will always be able to win by default rather than need to win by persuasion, simply by using these censorship superweapons on your political enemies. Wow. And you mentioned 70 years, right? We took 70 years to come into terms collectively and say, this might be not a very good idea to use. It seems that 70 years in terms of AI are not even dog years. It seems that it's literally 7 months, So, and I'm not seeing not a lot of people, unlike you, besides you rather, that are mentioning, sounding the red alarm in terms of censorship and, the implications in democracy, saying, we should really, maybe if the implied message here, Mike, is that maybe we should put a pause into AI altogether, just to reevaluate the priorities, the incentives here. So that conversation, how would that unfold in terms of, trying to just put back the Pandora's box into the box? Well, there's a big difference between development and deployment, right? So developing the techniques. So a lot of this has to do with again, this technique called NLP, natural language processing, which is the sort of, because that's a very different thing than what's happening right now with generative AI. So right now you've got, you've got things like Midjourney and Chat GPT, and you've got these sort of generative capacities that are very new to create very lifelike, pieces of literature that even a writer might not, an experienced writer might not be able to do himself or herself. And Midjourney, the ability to just instantly create at a visual level what might take an artist years, you can do in seconds. That is a different thing than the NLP, the natural language processing censorship story that I'm talking about. They are related in a certain way, but the threat that I'm primarily focused on is one particular field of development and deployment of these censorship super weapons, which is about the meaning, the political, and the social meaning of words. When somebody says, it just came out, for example, that the FBI created this code base of words for right-wing extremists. And the day will come when they're doing it for left-wing and for, this is the universal thump gets passed around. I'm not trying to make this a partisan thing. They've said, and people who use the word based, or he used the word friends, FRENS, they have this code book of things. And the way that would get translated into the AI is an account that uses like those words in a context that does not match certain other grammatical cues is going to automatically be identified by the machine learning. They're going to ingest all the training data, everybody who's ever used those words in their entire digital histories. Then they will create these network maps of who uses those words. And then from there, you can create these confined nets of identified wrong thinkers who belong to an extremist movement because they used a word that the FBI has identified as a marker for an extremist. That's the way that gets translated. That is a different thing than something like Midjourney or ChatGPT, which have their own risks, but are more about sort of AI ethics and political influence than on the censorship specific aspect of it. But one thing that I just will say, I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but there was an incredible moment where there's a guy named Elliot Higgins who runs a shop called Bellingcat, highly influential firm, funded essentially by the CIA through one of the cutouts of the National Endowment for Democracy. And when the Donald Trump indictment was announced a few months ago in New York City, and Trump was facing 138 years in jail from the New York City Attorney DA's office.
Yeah.
This group Bellingcat, Elliot Higgins, who runs it, who had been warning about the use of deepfakes for political influence for like 3 years. I mean, this is like a CIA-funded, AI ethics guy who's talking about how deepfakes are a threat to the democratic world order. He was the guy who personally put out this giant batch of deepfakes that went around the internet of Trump being rounded up by SWAT teams and Trump being, Trump taking, bazookas into the streets of New York City and being surrounded by cops. And, a lot of people were fooled, or at least there was a deep, visceral impression of the case itself, because there were no pictures coming out of that courtroom indictment period, but there was a huge clamoring demand for it. And the images that were seeded there came from a CIA-funded, guy who had been warning about the ethics of deepfakes. So when I think about, regulation of LLMs and ChatGPT and Midjourney and deepfakes, I think, the problem is regulation is needed, but the people who are going to be writing those regulations are going to be the people who need to be regulated. The same thing with the Russian bot and troll farm thing. The people who made the determinations about Russian bots were the people buying and deploying fake Russian bot farms. So you've got this massive issue where the problem is the people who need nuclear non-proliferation agreements for us to be protected from are the people who are writing the rules. So, until we can have some sort of kind of political regime change, so to speak, so that we actually have people in place who are able to behave ethically in this space, I'm not sure that smart regulation is possible without a threat of total defunding, which I'm hoping that the House does.
Well, that summarizes into hiding in plain sight. These people are hiding in plain sight, virtue signaling, these are the dangers, and them themselves playing. So, okay, I wanted to ask you on, back to Elon Musk's rating decrease that really opened my eyes into at this new conversation. That really, what happened in your video, I'm going to put a link in the notes so people can watch your video for them to really become familiarized with it, because we don't really have that much of a time for the whole context. But what you said there was that he literally just told these censor masters that we're not going to play your game. But these censor masters are not private companies like ChatGPT, or maybe they are in a way. But what you were saying is these are government-funded corporations, government-funded NGOs, and even DARPA and CIA, money is being spent there. So, and in previous conversations, you've also discussed the interactions, the interplay, the dance between big corporations, big tech, and, the American exceptionalists, the great companies, and government. So all of these themes really collide into Elon Musk and to what decision was made. So when the government tells, or let's just do a thought experiment, Elon Musk, which you summarized in your tweet, in your video, Elon Musk says, we're not going to play this game. That's the implied message. What does the government say then? How does that interaction unfold? And, your thoughts into this.
So Elon Musk is a really fascinating figure in terms of his unique leverage with the U.S. government. So when I was at the State Department and I was running cyber for basically all things connected to the internet for U.S. foreign policy, SpaceX was very important for U.S. diplomacy. I think Elon Musk is responsible for something like 33% or some crazy proportion of all low Earth satellites flying around the globe, which are hugely important from everything from telecommunications to being able to use satellites to sort of pinpoint, accuracy surveillance for the U.S. military, to various things that go into sort of, CIA intelligence reports, to the State Department's just vision on the chessboard of a particular territory or country or region. And so the U.S. government is very reliant on Elon Musk's private properties for much of our defense diplomacy and intelligence work. They lean very heavily on Tesla for green diplomacy and climate diplomacy. There was a whole Twitter kerfuffle a few years ago when Elon Musk was accused of facilitating a U.S. coup in Bolivia over lithium, which is one of the key rare earth minerals necessary for Tesla car batteries and for the electricity revolution, the climate revolution. And Elon Musk replied in a tweet, "We will coup whoever we want." We'll basically say, this is a company that had been massively all of Elon Musk's companies have been massively subsidized by the federal government. I mean, even SpaceX, the original rockets were negotiated through DARPA and through CIA back channels for acquisition of the rockets that those became. Again, same thing with Tesla. I think it was something like $5 billion in subsidies. At the same time, there is a reliance on Elon Musk to be able to lend those assets for U.S. government work. And if the U.S. government were to crack down on Musk in a heavy-handed way through something like CFIUS, for example, CFIUS is a technique to essentially nationalize private assets in the name of national security. This is a very, very heavy-handed mechanism, only used in very rare circumstances. There was a period when Twitter was announced to be acquired by Elon Musk, that you had these like 4-star generals and national security super spooks openly talking about, should we use CFIUS to nationalize Twitter? Because if Elon Musk allows Donald Trump back on the platform, it could destroy American democracy. And so we need the government to take over. They were talking about this. I mean, they didn't go through with it. But the fact is one of the reasons that Musk has some leverage here in order to stop the development of this AI censorship superweapon, at least from ingesting Twitter data, although we can talk about there are some carve-outs of that, is the fact that if they were to really cram down on Musk without some sort of backup plan, I mean, the message that it would send to the international community around the safety of private investments in the U.S. Right now, the U.S. is locked in an existential trade war with China and around, you've got all of these, whether it's UAE, Saudi Arabia, the EU market, Brazil, there is a huge tug of war about where foreign capital is going to flow. Is it going to flow to China? Is it going to flow to the U.S.? And if the U.S. were to use some sort of heavy-handed mechanism to kneecap the richest man in the world with internationally beloved corporations like Tesla, SpaceX, and Twitter, because Twitter wouldn't let, DARPA build a censorship superweapon. I mean, that would send a shockwave message to the international community that I think because of Musk's standing, he has a unique ability to maybe buffer against it. Like I said before, if Musk was running a lemonade stand, I'm not sure that he would have, but he was the world's richest man from selling orange juice or something. He would not have the leverage that he has because the Defense Department does not rely on orange juice, in order to wage the war in Ukraine with Starlink. It doesn't rely on orange juice, but so Musk actually may be able to put his elbows out, but he may not be. There's a lot of questions about whether or not Linda Yaccarino, the new CEO, was hired as a compromised candidate to put some power back in the national security state adjacent folks, because she was the former head of advertising networks for the World Economic Forum, who Musk himself just months earlier was conflating with a kind of, devilish back-channeling cabal that secretly rules the world. And then he handpicks, their advertising head in the middle of his own, existential struggle to bring advertisers back to the platform. So Musk is one of these figures who sort of, tap dances on the head of a pin here. And it's not clear whether or not what he did with the data scraping is a sort of cynical business move just to try to get people to buy more verified accounts. That way you have access to, 10,000 tweets rather than 1,000. Or if it was because bots are going to have a big impact on this new, just yesterday, they rolled out this advertiser revenue for creators model. You can imagine how that could be gamed if you could have bots that were able to just mass view and generate fake ad revenue for creators. You could imagine, this is totally independent of the censorship issue. You can imagine how that could be gained by simply buying bot farms to just visit your account every day. And now you're raking in tens of thousands of dollars in Twitter ad revenue that's falsely generated. So from that perspective, Elon Musk, knowing that was about to be rolled out, he may have done it for that. But it does have this side effect of potentially massively undermining the ability to use these AI censorship superweapons to control elections all around the world. And I would not be surprised if there are conversations happening right now between the national security state folks and Twitter to have an exception for their own, data scraping capacities, or they may just go the old-fashioned way, and rather than ingesting 900 million tweets, immediately, as they used to be able to do, it wouldn't be that hard for the Defense Department necessarily to buy 10,000 verified accounts and simply ingest at a sort of chunked level what used to be ingested all at once, and then that could potentially have the upside, bringing the U.S. government onto Elon Musk's payroll as they mass subscribe for accounts just so that they can data scrape. So there's a lot of 4D chess here that it's hard to cut through the fog of war about.
That's really interesting. And, as we begin to unfold the conversation, Mike, we're beginning to wrap it up. Of course, you're invited for another conversation in the future because, again, if you could see the notes and the questions I have for you, there are many. And after this conversation that I will release, and there are going to be more questions. So my question here is the implications of all of this. On a macro scale, we kind of touched it on, the elections and all of these scenarios, really Orwellian scenarios where they're controlling just a few big tech companies are really playing quote unquote God with everything just for their own personal interest or just because, they can and so they do. I don't really know why would they do it. Now, in every single metric, they've won the game, right? So I don't know why they want to keep doing it. It's just, that's a philosophical question for another time, Mike. But here, what I'm trying to ask you is the implications for me, for example, for the regular individual who lives under a democracy? What are these implications coming into a 2024 election with AI censorship? And how, who should really be worried about this coming into fruition?
Well, we're seeing the emergence of a very balkanized internet. The fact is from 2018 to 2022, these AI censorship superweapons were completely inescapable because the senior leadership of every platform in the world essentially was all captured by the same entities who were developing these AI censorship superweapons. That is, the trust and safety teams at Google, at Twitter, at Facebook, at TikTok, and Reddit, they were all working with the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security. Right now, Twitter, for example, still has censorship layers. It's going to take years for Elon Musk's team to disentangle all of the trust and safety censorship layers that were appended on to the various distribution algorithms from 2018 to present. But the fact is the 2024 election is going to be a very it's going to depend on how much pressure is brought to bear on alternative platforms and Musk. Like we're seeing right now that the Facebook alternative, Threads, already people have tried to create new accounts on there, and as soon as they log in, they're notified that they've been identified as repeat misinformation spreaders, and that their accounts are going to be throttled before they even post. And they know this when they log in. There have been dozens of screenshots from extremely high-profile individuals who, the moment they've created their account, they're notified that they've been identified by independent fact-checkers as a repeat misinformation spreader. And when people try to follow their accounts, they're given these warning signs that they're repeat misinformation spreaders. That means all of them are going to be algorithmically throttled right out of the gate using AI censorship techniques. That is, everything they say is going to be filtered into these AI models, and if they become influential on Threads, everyone they're connected to is also going to be downranked. The specific words they use are going to be assigned a toxicity score rating that is going to tank it. It's not clear that Twitter is going to have that. Now, they may be built in stealth under Linda Yaccarino. It may not. There is a kind of question about what happens to the Titanic when it hits an iceberg and there's one little hole. Can the whole thing kind of go under over it? There was this race to make sure that there was a silicon curtain that descended over the entirety of social media from 2018 to 2022, so that there was no platform where dissent would be allowed to be distributed. Elon Musk has so far done many brave actions to put a hole in that Titanic. And the question is in 2024, is that going to be enough to potentially, sink this behemoth of a bad actor, or at least will it give people freedom so that if they want to be on a more information curated platform like Threads or Facebook or Google, that they can, if they want a no holds barred free speech debate where all walks of political life are welcome to speak their truth, then they can go to Twitter. So that what I'm really concerned about, though, is it's been very disconcerting to watch Mark Zuckerberg's redemption arc in the eyes of the national security state and news media. After the 2016 election, he could do no right. He was hauled before the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was threatened with breakups by Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, and now he can do no wrong. I'm very concerned that they will build up Threads as a Twitter alternative. It will start getting government support. It'll start getting, being built up as this sort of replacement so that something can be done to crush or bankrupt Twitter, and it won't be this crisis level event because everyone will fall into the arms of Threads. And if that can be done ahead of the 2024 election, then they can reimpose this kind of totalizing censorship infrastructure. Even if Elon Musk does the right thing, if they simply bankrupt him through boycotts or through regulation. I mean, look, we're 1 month out from a mega regulatory bomb being dropped in the EU. I'm sorry, final closing point. On August 25th, the disinformation rules of the Digital Markets Act in Europe are going to come into effect. The Digital Markets Act was something I dealt with personally. I fielded phone calls from Google lobbyists when I was at State when they were trying to stop this thing from getting passed, or at least in its most aggressive form. The EU market is going to require compliance with its disinformation laws. I am afraid that Twitter, if it wants to retain a market in the UK, in France, in Germany, which it's going to need to do to be a relevant platform, they may need to censor all manner of political speech simply for compliance with these new EU regulations. There are all these regulatory threats. I mean, these guys have so many cards up their sleeve, what we're up against. And, all we can do right now is spread the word and try to manifest it in Congress and in lawsuits and in media to try to put as much pressure as we can to try to bring about that kind of nuclear nonproliferation we talked about.
Mm. So does it seem for you, in your perspective, that this new election cycle will be more open or will be more prone, with the whole nuclear AI bomb being unleashed? Will it be more, difficult to really embrace democracy in a way in this election?
It's it's hard to say. Like I said, there's so many wild cards right now.
Yeah.
Twitter is now more or less a free speech platform. You can talk about COVID-19. You can talk about masks, vaccines, mandates, Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci. You can talk about all of these totally censored topics that were censored for 3 years before that. You can talk about, elections, and you can talk about, a lot of very, very sensitive policy debates that were totally closed off. So in that respect, it's freer. There's also been challenges to the funding of a lot of the censorship architecture lately. It's unclear that a lot of the forces that seemed so invincible in 2020 and 2022 are going to be invincible in 2024. But as I say, they have so many tricks up their sleeve. It's what if these disinformation laws in 2024 start requiring political disinformation? All it would take is a couple definitional changes. And then suddenly, what is Twitter just going to cut off all of Europe? You can't even talk to people across the other side of the Atlantic. I mean, that would instantly turn Twitter into an echo chamber. It would destroy the thing that makes it so special as a global platform. So all of that remains to be negotiated. It's hard to peer through that fog of war for 2024, except to look at the pieces as they are on the board now and say it's a really fascinating time to be alive.
It is, Mike, and your work with the Foundation for Freedom of Line really shedding a light into all of these chess plays that we're seeing. I love the metaphor that you used today with chess, and also for me, what opened my eyes into this whole AI new tech world was the game of Go, when Go lost, to the machine.
Right, AlphaGo, yes,
that was mind blowing for me. So, Mike, I really appreciate you joining me today. I really, this has really been an enlightening conversation. Hopefully one that we get to talk more in the future. And, with Foundation for Freedom of Line, you're on a mission, like you say, to restore the golden age of the internet. So, I believe that with these conversations and also with you being courageous enough to just open perspectives into, for example, for me, that, this is really playing into my daily lives. And, really the internet is not the lemonade stand. It's really a decision making into my own time on Earth, literally, and bigger implications on my macro scale. But Mike, I appreciate you joining me. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your time as well, and have a great day.